Welcome to Roundabout Oxford, a podcast from the University of Mississippi Libraries.
This week's episode of Roundabout Oxford is all about food and the recipes used to make it. First, UM science librarian Harley Rogers tells Brooke Gross about her work with the Margaret Chase Smith Recipe Research Collaborative at the University of Maine and shares tips for discovering what recipes can tell us about historical trends in cooking, as well as our own family histories. We'll also hear family recipe stories from Harley, Brooke, and other library faculty and staff. Finally, Greg Johnson from Archives and Special Collections tells us about the library's exciting new food exhibit, The Southern Plate, running now through December 8th. Stay tuned.
My name is Brooke Gross, and today I'm here with Harley Rogers. Harley is currently our science librarian, but she has a background in researching food and recipes as historical artifacts. So today she's going to talk about evaluating family history through recipes. Why don't you start by telling us a little more about your food research and what exactly we mean when we say recipes as history?
So, my interest in this topic really started while I was attending the University of Maine for my undergraduate degree. And so, with the guidance of my professor and eventually mentor, Dr. Rachel Snell, I began really diving deep into reading recipes as artifacts and finding significance in food, which is, something we all enjoy but don't always think too hard about. I was invited to join the Margaret Chase Smith Recipe Research Collaborative, which was an interdisciplinary group of researchers on the UMaine campus that were interested in looking at the former senator's personal recipes. And so my research in the collaborative focused on the political and historical aspects of recipes and would eventually become the foundation of my honors thesis. But since then, I've continued my research as an individual, and I've taken a closer look at my family's recipes. And I've been trying to share some of the tools for finding history in family recipes with others, which is why I'm excited to be here and talking about it today. Really at the core of it, when we say recipe is history, we're talking about the tidbits of information that we can pull from recipes, especially physical recipe cards passed down. Traditionally, women and families did much of the cooking. And as you kind of go back through the generations, there isn't much of a paper trail for researchers or descendants to look at to kind of, understand their, great-great-grandmother's lives. A lot of things about their daily lives were considered unimportant, or maybe they just, didn't survive being passed down. Family recipes is often an exception to that. So I like to think of recipes as a way to get a glimpse into the lives of the women before us.
So what can recipes tell you about family history?
Yeah, so surprisingly quite a lot. When I first looked at a recipe card, I asked myself a series of questions. So first things first, what does a card physically look like? Is this a handwritten card? Is this a grocery store clipping? Is it one of many copies? Are there signs of wear? Is this a card that was brought out every single time and has a bunch of mysterious stains on it? Or, is it in relatively pristine condition? Another thing that I look at when I'm looking at the physical card are annotations. I once came across a community cookbook that was gifted from a grandmother to a grandson, and the grandmother had written bad and not good on two of the recipes. But then, on the other recipes that were in the book, she had added adjustments to the other recipes, and she even highlighted all of her own recipes that she had included in the cookbook. With little notes like, this is your dad's favorite, or this is the way, I'd make it for you, which I found really, really wholesome and really fun to look at. So the next thing that I would do when I would look at the recipe would be ask myself, what type of recipe is this? This can be pretty obvious. Is it a dessert? Is it a savory dish? Is it a lunch or a snack? But then we look a little closer at it, thinking, when would this be served and how many does it serve? So a recipe that makes 24 cookies is more likely to be brought to a social event rather than, being whipped up to feed a family of 3 at home. But if we're looking at an overnight cinnamon roll recipe, that might be the perfect thing for a busy mother to make the night before. so that she doesn't have to worry about it the next morning. She can just pop them in the oven and they're ready to go. I found that a lot of recipes, often the most simplistic ones, would be reserved for the family, while other recipes would be brought out if company were coming over or if it was being brought to a social event. There's that almost performative element of food. This is the thing that I make. This is what I bring to events. It might be a little bit more fancy than your average Tuesday meal. The next thing that I'd look at are the actual ingredients of the recipe. Are these products, again, that would be found in the average home on an average night, or are there specialty or seasonal items that would make it, a little more expensive, or a little, you'd only have it during a certain time of year? Another element, part of the types of ingredients would be, is it calling for canned items or fresh products? So some recipes will specify a preference for one or the other, and sometimes they'll even, add alternative instructions if you're using fresh versus canned. We can definitely see a trend as you're looking at recipes. As more women were working outside of the home, more recipes started to include canned items and other convenience elements, so that it would save the people who are cooking, oftentimes women, time. If they're working, they come home, they want to make something really quick. Canned items are a great way to do that. So we definitely see an uptick in that when we're looking at recipes from the mid 20th century. And then some of the last few questions I ask are, is this a regional dish? Is there a dish, or is this a dish with different names? And this can kind of help note any cultural significance to the food or the recipe that we're looking at. And then finally, the best part comes testing. And the most important question that comes from this is the recipe easy to replicate? So in the collaborative that I was part of, not only were we just looking at the recipe cards, we were actually testing the recipes as well. Some of the recipes would turn out as expected, while others just wouldn't. And this is definitely the case with a lot of recipes, not just the collection that we were looking at in the collaborative. And there's a few reasons for that. The first reason is assumed knowledge. I've lost count of how many recipes I've read that say bake until done, or in a hot oven, or until the consistency is correct. What are any of those things? So if you haven't made it before, if you don't know what a hot oven is or what the consistency is supposed to look like, it's going to make it a little bit more challenging when you're trying to bake blindly. This can often be accidental, especially in situations where your family member knows how to make something and you just ask them to write it down and they just assume you know things. Or perhaps they originally had used a base recipe, but they kind of made it their own over the years. And so they give you the base recipe, think it's going to work. It doesn't work out because, you don't have all of the details that make it special. Now, occasionally people will intentionally write recipes wrong. So I've had a lot of discussions with people, through this work. And so I've gathered a few funny stories. I once heard that a mother-in-law just didn't like the wife. And so she gave a slightly altered version of the family's bread. And so, for years, they just could not make the family bread the right way. There was another time where someone was known for bringing a dish to all of the community functions. So whenever they were asked for that recipe, the person would give out a bare bones version of that recipe so that it didn't include whatever the special ingredient was that made theirs so special. And so while these make up, a small amount of cases, they are quite funny, but also a little sad too when family recipes are lost. So it leaves an interesting challenge to, figure out how exactly does Aunt Sue make her potato salad taste like that, and things along those lines. But at the very least, when we have recipes to study, we can learn about the kinds of food being made, understand if there is a performative element, understand the cost associated with meals. We can learn about the meals that would be made when time was short or cost of ingredients were too high. And then, they can also shed light on preferences and the style of cooking that a family member would prefer. From my experience, it has been great to look at my own family's recipes a little closer, especially while I have my grandmother to talk to about her recipes and her mother and grandmother's recipes, which, I would only be able to guess at this point where they have both passed now. And so, it doesn't have to be full-blown research for everybody, but I would encourage people to take a little closer at the recipes and, the recipes in their family and, the people who are making them in their families.
I actually stumbled upon some of my family history myself through recipes over the holidays. One of our favorite recipes is for sweet potato casserole, which my dad's Aunt Martha in North Carolina always made for Thanksgiving. When my mom started helping out with the Thanksgiving meal, however many years ago, she convinced Aunt Martha to write down the recipe for her, even though I'm pretty sure Aunt Martha herself never really used an official recipe, just based on, watching her in the kitchen. But over Christmas, I was helping my mom make the sweet potato casserole, and I realized that she still has the recipe that Aunt Martha wrote down for her, in addition to another handwritten copy that my mom made with some extra notes for herself. So kind of extra annotations like you were talking about. She pulls out both copies every time she makes it. And when I asked her why she kept the original, she said it was because she had to keep Aunt Martha's handwriting, even though my mom mostly references her own copy.
That's really, really sweet. There really is some sentimental social aspect to recipes that I really, really love. It reminds me, my grandmother has these really big binders, almost like photo albums filled with recipes. And so as I was going through them one day, I found a zucchini, quote, apple pie recipe. And it was handwritten on this really beautiful note card that had "thinking of you" printed in the corner with a picture of flowers. And so the recipe card was given to my grandmother from her mother, Vera. And Vera had written the word "always" above the "thinking of you" and underlined them, like all the words. And, I've always known how close my great grandmother and my grandmother were to each other. And so this was just really such a sweet find because it shows, how the recipe was gifted, how it shows, affection between a mother and a daughter. And I have a recipe card written in my great grandmother's handwriting. And, later after I brought it to my grandmother's attention, I actually found out that this was my great grandmother's recipe. So, just thinking about how this one recipe card has tied, all of these women in my family tree together is just really, really special. I think that food gives us the sense of community and a reason to be social, which is why I think that recipes do become so special to families.
So, thinking about things that are special and kind of intimate and things like that, I mean, what makes a recipe special? I'm imagining lots of like quote unquote grandma's famous chocolate chip cookies out there that are actually Nestle Toll House. No judgment, listeners. I must confess, I actually uncovered a similar situation in my family recently. We have what we call a Thelma Polly cake, a recipe from my great grandmother in Texas, which my mom makes at least once a year because it's my dad's favorite. For 25 years, I believed it was a sacred original family recipe, only to discover that it is just a Texas sheet cake. My great grandmother had a neighbor who was named Thelma Polly, and Thelma Polly always made that cake. So when my great grandmother got the recipe from her, she called it a Thelma Polly cake. So at what point does a recipe actually become historically significant or meaningful?
I think that's a hilarious story, and you are certainly not alone. Many people's, granny's super special, crunch cookie is actually a Toll House cookie. Or, in your case, it's just named after the person that they got it from. But I would still say that it's special regardless. To me, and through all of this, I would say that what makes a recipe special or meaningful is the act of actually making it and sharing it and remembering it. We're in an age where we can find a dozen variations of any recipe we want in a matter of seconds just by Googling it. And so while, those recipes might have significance to the creator, it doesn't gain any value for us until it actually enters our own kitchen or our own family's kitchen. The recipes in our family's recipe box are significant because, they can piece together these parts of history and represent the times that you've had or the times that your family have had together. So I think about when I was in college, I lived with one of my best friends, and she and I would make what we call college pasta all the time. And essentially, all that consists of is a bunch of spaghetti noodles, butter, and Parmesan cheese. And we loved it. We had it multiple times a week at some points in college. But it was really, really representative of two 19-year-olds, short on cash, short on time, but we were having fun, and we're just, focusing on getting our assignments in on time. We didn't have time, or we didn't want to have time to bother with, making anything fancy. We just would have our college pasta. And so, now years later, I still occasionally will make our college pasta, and I'll think about, that fun time. And at the end of the day, it tastes good. It's why I make it. But, is the recipe simple? Absolutely. But did it represent, where we were in that life and, like a snapshot of that time? Yes. And so, whether the recipe takes 5 hours to make and, 3 trips to 2 different stores or, different stores to get all the ingredients, or, as simple as cheese and noodles, the significance of the recipe really comes from the people who are making it and the people who are eating it.
It's interesting for me to think about how many family recipes must have changed over time as well, depending on who was making it or what they had on hand or what they could remember without an original copy. My mom tried to create or recreate her Mima's recipe for ambrosia, which I thought was a kind of honey candy, but my mom knows as a kind of fruit salad, but she couldn't find any modern equivalent that matched her memory of it. She remembered a few of the ingredients, like oranges and apples, but there were other ingredients in the online recipe she found that didn't seem familiar, like cherries and coconut. She asked her dad about it, who said that the recipe was supposed to have cherries in it, but his mom took them out because he didn't like cherries. My grandfather also said that her ambrosia wasn't creamy at all, which was totally contradictory to what my mom remembered. And I told my mom that most old fruit salad recipes that I've seen used mayonnaise or sour cream instead of whipped cream. She was horrified. What we ended up making had apples, oranges, cherries, walnuts, whipped cream, coconut, and mini marshmallows. My mom liked it, but she said it wasn't anything like her Mima's ambrosia. So now I think we've decided to just try a new version every year.
That's really great. And I hope you do continue to make new versions of it each year. I do think it's really interesting how recipes like that change and how the name can stay, but the outcome of the recipe just evolves and becomes something entirely different. It really reminds me of a recipe that I found while I was in the collaborative. And it's one of the reasons why I include the question, are there any other names for it in the research process when we're looking at the recipe? The recipe that I was looking at was called Blueberry Supreme. And when I searched for a contemporary version of this recipe using that name, I could not find a recipe that matched it or came, close to it. Some other names that I found that would come up when I typed in Blueberry Supreme were Blueberry Lush, Blueberry Yum Yum, Blueberry Delight, and all of those were almost identical. But I could never find a recipe that was similar to the original recipe, which at the end of the day might have been for the best because it called for raw eggs in a dish that didn't get baked. And all of the contemporary versions just did not include eggs in it. So, maybe it is for the best, but it was really, really interesting to see this old recipe and the new version, or the versions of it under the same name now, when they really only resembled each other in name. Yes, they all had blueberry in it. Yes, they all had a filling layer in it, but the actual, the process of making it, the ingredients of the cream layer, just entirely different. So it's so interesting to look at the history of some recipes, especially recipes of the same name.
Well, I've shared a few of my funny family recipe stories. Before we sign off, I'd love to hear about some of your favorite family recipes.
I think my favorite story is how I discovered how to make my grandmother's famous hot pudding. And I say famous, but I mean famous just to my family. I spent most of my childhood visiting my grandparents, almost every day. And I always would look forward to eating hot pudding at the end of the day after dinner. And my grandfather and I, and really the rest of the family, would love this pudding, but we didn't know how to make it. And so we always relied on my poor grandmother to make it. So there would be nights where my papa and I would practically beg her to make hot pudding. And, Nana would huff and puff some days, but, most of the time she'd just get up and go to the kitchen, and then she'd come out a few minutes later with the most delicious peanut butter hot pudding that I've ever tasted in my life, still to this today. And so when I started going through my grandmother's recipe books, I asked for the hot pudding recipe because I couldn't find it. Also, I think it's important to note that I was in the kitchen with her growing up all the time, but I never committed some of the steps to memory for this pudding. So long story short, she wrote down the recipe for me, and I was shocked. The recipe was only 4 ingredients plus the peanut butter or chocolate, depending on which flavor of hot pudding you wanted. And to top it off, she just microwaved it. She would mix the ingredients together and she'd microwave it for intervals of 2 minutes at a time until it was the right consistency. And, I asked her, I remember you making this on the stovetop. And she's like, yeah, well, it's faster and no one has ever noticed the difference. And no, we've made them back to back, and there's no difference between microwaving it and cooking it on the stovetop. I just think it was such a funny shock that this dessert that I had on such a high pedestal for me, my family, it's just the most basic ingredients that you would just have in your house, and a few minutes in the microwave. It really just goes to show how special recipes and sharing moments around food with family is, and that there are things that can surprise you once you start looking kind of closer at your own family's food and recipes.
That's amazing. I have to admire the simplicity. Thank you so much for being here, Harley. This has been such a fun topic, especially coming off the holiday season. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me and share some ways that we can all take a closer look at our family recipes. I think our listeners will have a great time using some of the tips you've shared. Now let's hear from other library folks about how food has impacted their family history. First, Christina shares how family recipes help preserve family memories.
Yeah, so when my grandmother passed away and we were clearing out my grandparents' house, one of the things I wanted to make sure I saved was her little recipe box. And it's pink and yellow and white, and it was probably produced by like Betty Crocker or something in the 50s. One of those things you remember so much about going to grandma's house is grandma's cooking. So I really wanted to make sure I kept that. And then it was really fun. I've done it a couple of times, but to go through that box and to look at the little index cards and look at what she thought she wanted to save. Some of them were clearly produced by some brand to get you to use their product, and sometimes those sound good, sometimes they don't. Some of them my grandmother had cut out of magazines or out of newspapers and taped them or glued them to a card. And then there were some of them where she written them out and by hand, and those, of course, I had to keep, like most of those, because it was her handwriting. That was just so much like trip down memory lane to remember either when I've had that meal, because they were things that, I remembered her cooking, or just, wow, she still had the recipe for that. And so there was, some of the recipes I was really glad to get. There was one that it's like the most memorable grandma meal. It was something we always asked for whenever we went, and it was called like baked pancake. And it's basically Yorkshire pudding. But she did it in a 9 by 13 pan. Last year, just before Christmas, I was, looking at magazines, and one of the magazines produced a recipe that was essentially that baked pancake, grandma's baked pancake, only kind of updated with fruit and nuts, very southern, pear and pecans, and then maple syrup. And it was fun to connect the memory of grandma's cooking to this new recipe as I made it for my visiting family for breakfast one morning. And tried to, remind my mom and my brother, do you remember when grandma used to make these? And so to try then to pass on memories of grandma to my niece and nephew who never met her through those recipes.
Next, Tess talks about how one little candy can pack a big financial punch.
My name is Tess Graham, and I am here at the University of Mississippi now, but it's been a long journey. I grew up in an old order Mennonite family in Pennsylvania, outside of Lancaster. And this is a story of a cousin of mine. And of course, we were all cousins, but her name was Martha, and she was beautiful. She was just gorgeous. And she didn't fit into the community. She didn't like all of the restrictions and everything. And usually women by about 15 to 16 were married. And she was not. She was about 16. I would have been about 5. So she still lived at home, and she would come over to our house, and my parents would pay her to scrub the floors and do a few other of the bigger cleaning tasks. And I really liked Martha because she let me ride her like a horse. I was horse crazy, and she would get with her long dress, she would put on her knee pads underneath her long skirt, and she would get down on her hands and knees and scrub the floors. But she would let me ride her all around. And she would also bring me mashed potato candy. And so that's what we're going to talk about in a minute. But she sold her mashed potato candy, and she also sold worms, which is the Pennsylvania Dutch way of saying worms. So she sold worms for fishing to fishermen, and she would be out on the road whenever she wasn't cleaning or doing another odd job. She would sit out on the road with her lawn chair, and she would sell her worms and her mashed potato candy. And mashed potato candy was 25 cents a slice, and worms were a nickel, worms. And so, that was just kind of the way it was when I was growing up. But then a few years later, I got a little older and heard that Martha had taken up with an Englishman who had a car, and everybody was, all up in arms about that and thought it was terrible. And she was leaving the church and all that. And however, he apparently broke up with her, and the next thing that happened was that her money disappeared. Her worm and her candy money stash disappeared. And everybody was like, oh, that's awful, However, within a day or so, the police there from the next biggest city, and they wanted to talk about him and get a description of him and find out more about him. And they said that her stash had been over $10,000. So if you think about candy at 25 cents a slice and worms, a worm for a nickel, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of candy and a lot of worms. However, I do remember that they caught him. They got all her money back. So that's the end of the mashed potato candy story.
Finally, Abby shares a story that proves how consuming a meal can be just as significant as making it.
So my mom comes from a big family, including her. There are 5 kids. So with her parents, that's 7 people that she grew up with. And as the kids got older and moved out of the house, my grandparents decided to have Monday night dinner, where every Monday night, every single week, whoever was in town would come over to their house and eat dinner. And this tradition continued, well into when I was in college. So probably at least 30 years. So one night in, my mom believes, the mid 1980s, the family was at Monday night dinner. And at this point, my parents were dating. A couple of my aunts and uncles were already married, so it was a pretty big group that had gathered. And my grandmother had made spaghetti with meat sauce for dinner. As the food is going around the table and everyone is serving themselves, it becomes apparent that not enough pasta has been made to feed everyone at the table. And so my grandmother, in her little Houston, Texas accent, says, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just eat the sauce." And to this day in my family, whenever, especially when it centers around food, someone has to make a sacrifice. So we run out of bread, we run out of dessert. Someone often, my mother or one of her siblings will say, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just eat the sauce."
Now, Greg tells us about an exciting new food exhibit coming to Library's Special Collections.
Greg Johnson here from Archives and Special Collections. We're excited to announce the opening of our new exhibit called The Southern Plate, an archival exhibition on food. This exhibit uses materials from our collections to examine a number of aspects of Southern foodways, from grits and greens to everything in between. Visitors can see some of our large cookbook collection displayed. In addition to celebrity, community, and church cookbooks, you can see examples of 19th and 20th century handmade recipe books featuring family favorites from fudge to blackberry wine. We also look at the intersections of food and other aspects of society, from looking at rationing of food during wartime, to black food cooperatives and land ownership, to desegregating Southern dining establishments. There are displays on blues songs about food, as well as the role of food in various literature from Southern writers. We're excited to also have some displays curated by the staff at the Institute of Child Nutrition, featuring materials from their archives, housed here on the campus of the University of Mississippi. Visitors can also browse oral histories from the Southern Foodways Alliance on our digital kiosks. This exhibit runs most of 2023, from January 23rd through December 8th. We are planning a series of events throughout the year featuring chefs, food historians, and more, so stay tuned.
Roundabout Oxford was created by Brian Corrigan, Taylor Fields, Alan Munschauer, Abigail Norris Davidson, Christina Streeter, and Alex Watson. Today's episode was produced by Elizabeth Batt, Brian Corrigan, Sarah Catherine Glass, Brooke Gross, Harley Rogers, and Alex Watson, with musical contributions from Brian Corrigan and Gail Herrera. Thank you for listening to Roundabout Oxford.